Marcus Hayes was a man who had achieved more in his life than most people could ever dream of. Born into a modest family in a small town in Ohio, he grew up watching his parents work tirelessly to make ends meet. His father was a mechanic who spent long hours under the hood of cars while his mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Despite their struggles, they always emphasized the importance of education and integrity. Marcus took those lessons to heart. He excelled in school, earning top grades and scholarships that eventually led him to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. From a young age, Marcus knew he wanted to make a difference in the world. He was drawn to stories of justice, of brave individuals standing up against corruption and fighting for what was right. This passion led him to pursue a career in law enforcement, a field where he believed he could have the greatest impact. After graduating with honors, Marcus joined the FBI, determined to rise through the ranks and bring about meaningful change from within the system. But the journey wasn't easy. As one of the few African-American agents in the Bureau at the time, Marcus faced challenges that his white colleagues never had to think about. There were subtle slights, a comment here, a dismissive glance there, that reminded him he didn't quite belong. Some doubted his abilities, assuming he had only been hired to fill a diversity quota. Others outright resented him, believing he hadn't earned his place. But Marcus refused to let these obstacles define him. Instead, he poured all his energy into proving himself, working harder and longer than anyone else. Over the years, Marcus climbed steadily up the ladder, earning promotions and accolades along the way. He became known for his sharp instincts, his ability to solve complex cases, and his unwavering commitment to fairness. Colleagues began to respect him, not just for his skills but also for his character. He treated everyone with dignity, regardless of their background or position. Whether it was comforting a victim during an investigation or mentoring a junior agent struggling to find their footing, Marcus had a way of making people feel seen and valued. By the time he reached his 40s, Marcus had become a household name in law enforcement circles. When the opportunity arose to lead the FBI, many expected him to decline. The role came with immense pressure and scrutiny, especially given the political climate at the time. But Marcus saw it as a chance to push for reforms he had long championed. He envisioned an FBI that not only protected the nation, but also upheld its highest ideals: equality, transparency, and accountability. His appointment as director made headlines around the world. It was historic. Marcus Hayes was the first African American to hold the position in the agency's century-long history. For many, his ascension symbolized progress, a sign that barriers were finally being broken down. Supporters celebrated him as a trailblazer, someone who embodied the promise of America itself. Critics, however, were less enthusiastic. They questioned whether he was qualified, pointing to his progressive views as evidence that he might prioritize politics over security. Others whispered behind closed doors, suggesting that his race had played too large a role in his selection. Despite the noise, Marcus remained focused on the task ahead. From day one, he implemented sweeping changes aimed at modernizing the Bureau and addressing long-standing issues like racial bias and misconduct. He launched training programs designed to educate agents on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation tactics. He pushed for stricter oversight of investigations involving marginalized communities, and he spoke openly about the need for collaboration between federal agencies and local law enforcement to build trust among citizens. Not everyone welcomed these efforts. Some veteran agents grumbled about the new direction the Bureau seemed to be taking. They argued that Marcus's reforms were unnecessary distractions from the real work of catching criminals and preventing terrorism. Others accused him of pandering to activists and politicians rather than focusing on national security. Even outside the FBI, resistance was fierce. Law enforcement unions criticized his calls for greater accountability, framing them as attacks on officers everywhere. Conservative media outlets labeled him soft on crime, while liberal pundits sometimes accused him of not going far enough. Through it all, Marcus stayed calm and composed. He understood that change rarely came without pushback, especially in institutions as deeply entrenched as the FBI. Rather than engaging in public disputes, he let his actions speak for themselves. Under his leadership, the Bureau successfully dismantled several major criminal networks, thwarted potential terror plots, and improved relationships with communities that had once distrusted law enforcement. Slowly but surely, even some of his harshest critics began to acknowledge his competence. Still, Marcus couldn't ignore the broader context in which he operated. Across the country, tensions between police and minority groups continued to simmer. High-profile cases of police brutality dominated the news cycle, sparking protests and calls for reform. Many looked to Marcus as a voice of reason, a leader who could bridge the divide between law enforcement and the communities they served. While flattered by the attention, Marcus felt the weight of expectation bearing down on him. He knew that, no matter how much he accomplished, there would always be those who judged him not by his achievements, but by the color of his skin. One evening, after a particularly grueling day on Capitol Hill, Marcus decided to take a rare moment for himself. He had spent hours testifying before Congress, defending his policies and urging lawmakers to support legislation aimed at holding rogue officers accountable. The hearing had been contentious, with fiery exchanges and pointed questions challenging both his motives and methods. By the time it ended, Marcus was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally drained. As he left the Capitol building, he debated whether to call for his security detail or drive himself home. It wasn't protocol for the director of the FBI to travel alone, but Marcus craved solitude. He needed time to clear his head, away from prying eyes and constant demands. Making up his mind, he slid behind the wheel of his sedan and started the engine. Little did he know this simple decision would set off a chain of events that would change everything, for him, for the FBI, and for the nation. The streets of Washington, D.C. were quiet that night, bathed in the glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car. Marcus drove slowly, savoring the stillness. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax, letting the hum of the tires against asphalt lull him into a sense of normalcy. He thought about his wife, Elena, waiting for him at home, and the warm dinner she had promised to prepare. He thought about the speech he planned to give the following week, outlining his vision for a fairer, more inclusive future. And for a brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was making a difference. As Marcus drove through the quiet suburban streets of Washington, D.C., he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The city was bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and the hum of his car's engine provided a soothing rhythm. For once there were no urgent phone calls, no meetings to rush to, and no pressing decisions weighing on his mind. It was just him, the road, and the promise of a peaceful evening at home with his wife, Elena. But that peace didn't last long. Out of nowhere, flashing blue and red lights appeared in his rearview mirror. At first, Marcus thought it might be a routine traffic stop, a minor inconvenience, nothing more. He hadn't been speeding or running any red lights, so he couldn't imagine what he had done wrong. Still, he pulled over smoothly, making sure to signal as he moved to the side of the road. His training as an FBI agent kicked in, reminding him to stay calm and cooperative. After all, he knew better than anyone how important it was to follow protocol during interactions with law enforcement. When the officer approached his vehicle, Marcus rolled down the window and greeted him with a polite smile. "Good evening, officer," he said, his voice steady and respectful. "Is there something I can help you with?" Before the officer could respond, Marcus noticed something odd. Instead of leaning down to speak to him, the officer remained standing upright, his hand resting conspicuously on the grip of his holstered gun. His posture was rigid, almost hostile. Marcus frowned slightly but decided not to make a fuss. He reached into his pocket to retrieve his identification, careful to keep his movements slow and deliberate so as not to alarm the officer. "I'm Marcus Hayes," he said calmly, holding up his credentials for the officer to see. "I'm the director of the FBI." For a moment, there was silence. Marcus expected the officer to apologize, perhaps even chuckle nervously at the mistake. Surely, once the officer realized who he was dealing with, the situation would resolve itself quickly. But instead of easing up, the officer's demeanor grew even more aggressive. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer barked, his voice loud and commanding. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Marcus froze. His heart began to race, though he did his best to maintain his composure. This wasn't right. Something about the situation felt off. Dangerous, even. He glanced at the officer, trying to gauge his intentions, but the man's expression gave nothing away. All Marcus could see was the glint of metal as the officer tightened his grip on his weapon. "Officer," Marcus said slowly, keeping his tone measured, "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm the FBI director. Here are my credentials." "I said step out of the vehicle," the officer interrupted, his voice rising sharply. "Now." By now, backup had arrived. 2 additional police cars screeched to a halt behind Marcus's sedan, their headlights illuminating the scene like a spotlight. More officers spilled out of the vehicles, surrounding Marcus's car with their guns drawn. Their faces were tense, their bodies coiled like springs ready to strike. To anyone watching, it looked as though they were dealing with a dangerous criminal, not a high-ranking government official. Marcus's mind raced. He knew the drill. He had overseen countless operations involving armed standoffs. But this was different. This wasn't a tactical exercise, it was real life. And he was the one being targeted. Despite his years of experience, he couldn't shake the sinking feeling in his stomach. He raised his hand slowly, showing that he posed no threat. "I'm unarmed," he said, his voice firm but calm. "I'm the FBI director. You can verify." "My identity, if you'd like." But the officers weren't listening. One of them yanked open the car door, grabbing Marcus roughly by the arm and pulling him out of the vehicle. Another officer immediately patted him down, searching for weapons or contraband. Marcus winced as the cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists, biting into his skin. He wanted to protest, to demand answers, but he knew better than to escalate the situation further. For now, all he could do was endure. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Why am I being treated like this?" One of the officers finally spoke up, though his tone was dismissive. "We got a report of a robbery nearby," he said. "The suspect matches your description." Marcus blinked in disbelief. A robbery? That made no sense. He had been driving straight from Capitol Hill, minding his own business. How could he possibly match the description of a suspect? And even if he did, shouldn't these officers have recognized him? Or at least taken a moment to confirm his identity before resorting to such extreme measures? "This is ridiculous," Marcus muttered under his breath, though he knew better than to argue aloud. Deep down, he understood what was happening. It wasn't about a robbery or a vague description. It was about the color of his skin. No matter how far he had risen in life, no matter how many accolades he had earned, he was still a black man in America. And that fact alone was enough to make him a target. The minutes dragged on as the officers continued to question him, their tone accusatory and condescending. They asked where he was coming from, where he was headed, and whether he had any proof of his identity beyond the credentials he had already shown them. Each question felt like another blow, chipping away at Marcus's dignity, yet he answered patiently, refusing to let anger get the better of him. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the officers radioed headquarters to verify Marcus's identity. When confirmation came back that he was indeed the FBI director, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by awkwardness and embarrassment. One by one, the officers lowered their weapons, their expressions softening as they realized the gravity of their mistake. "You're free to go, sir," one of them said gruffly, avoiding eye contact. "Sorry for the inconvenience." Inconvenience. The word struck Marcus like a slap in the face. What had just happened wasn't an inconvenience, it was a violation. It was a stark reminder of the systemic racism that permeated every level of society, including the very institutions he had dedicated his life to serving. As the officers removed the handcuffs and stepped aside, Marcus felt a mix of emotions swirling inside him: anger, humiliation, and a profound sense of disillusionment. He climbed back into his car without saying another word, gripping the steering, wheeled tightly as he tried to process what had just transpired. The drive home was anything but peaceful now. Every mile felt heavier than the last, each turn bringing fresh waves of frustration and sadness. By the time he pulled into his driveway, he was emotionally drained. Elena was waiting for him at the door, her face lighting up with a warm smile as she prepared to greet him. But the moment she saw his expression, her smile faded. She didn't need to ask what had happened. His eyes told the whole story. Without a word, Marcus walked past her and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry, not because he was weak, but because he was human. And in that moment, he realized that no amount of power or prestige could shield him from the harsh realities of the world he lived in. The next morning, Marcus woke up with a heavy heart. He had barely slept, his mind replaying the events of the previous night over and over again. The images were seared into his memory, the flashing lights, the drawn guns, the cold metal of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that lingered. It was the emotional toll, the realization that no matter how high he climbed, he could never escape the weight of his skin color. Elena had stayed up, late with him, listening as he poured out his frustration and pain. She held his hand, offering words of comfort, but even she couldn't fully ease the ache in his chest. "You don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger. "No one does." As dawn broke, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't let this incident go unnoticed or unaddressed. If anything, it reinforced why he had taken on the role of FBI director in the first place: to fight for justice, to challenge the systems that allowed such injustices to persist. But he also knew that speaking out would come at a cost. His position put him under constant scrutiny, and any misstep could be weaponized against him. By mid-morning, news of the traffic stop had spread like wildfire. Someone, likely a neighbor or passerby, had captured parts of the confrontation on their phone and uploaded the video online. Within hours, it went viral, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Clips of Marcus being pulled from his car at gunpoint circulated, alongside headlines like "FBI director mistaken for suspect" and "racial profiling targets top law enforcement official." The public reaction was swift and intense. Protesters took to the streets in cities nationwide, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus Hayes," and chanting slogans about ending systemic racism. Civil rights organizations issued statements condemning the officer's actions, calling for accountability and reform. Even some politicians weighed in, expressing shock and disappointment at the treatment of someone in Marcus's position. For many Americans, the incident served as a grim reminder of the pervasive nature of racial profiling. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to protecting the nation, who had risen to the highest levels of law enforcement, and yet he was still subjected to the same indignities faced by countless black men every day. The irony was not lost on anyone, but while the public rallied around Marcus, the response within the FBI was far more complicated. On the surface, there was an outpouring of support. Agents from across the country sent messages of solidarity, praising Marcus for his composure during such a harrowing ordeal. Some even confessed that they had experienced similar incidents themselves, though they had never spoken up before. However, beneath the surface, tensions simmered. Not everyone viewed the incident as a rallying cry for change. Among the ranks of veteran agents and senior officials, whispers of dissent began to circulate. Critics argued that Marcus's vocal stance on police reform had alienated key allies, both inside and outside the Bureau. They pointed to the growing divisions within the agency, suggesting that his leadership style was divisive rather than unifying. Anonymous leaks to the media painted an even darker picture. Reports emerged, alleging that morale within the FBI was at an all-time low, with some agents feeling disillusioned by what they perceived as Marcus's focus on political correctness over practical policing strategies. Others questioned whether his ability to lead had been compromised by the very reforms he sought to implement. Meanwhile, political pressure mounted. Members of Congress called for an investigation into the traffic stop, demanding answers about how and why such a grave mistake had occurred. Lawmakers grilled local police officials during heated hearings, accusing them of incompetence and bias. Yet despite the uproar, early reports suggested that the officers involved might face little more than a slap on the wrist. A conclusion, based on the flimsy justification that they were simply following procedure. This lack of accountability only fueled further protests. Activists decried the double standards at play. When ordinary citizens were treated this way, justice rarely prevailed. Now, even someone as powerful as the FBI director wasn't immune to the system's failures. The message was clear. If Marcus Hayes could be humiliated and dismissed so easily, what hope did anyone else have? Back at home, Marcus struggled to navigate the storm swirling around him. Publicly, he maintained his composure, issuing brief statements thanking those who supported him and reiterating his commitment to reform. Privately, however, he grappled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to lash out, to call out the hypocrisy and demand immediate consequences for the officers involved. Another part of him understood the complexities of the situation, the delicate balance between accountability and backlash, between pushing for change and avoiding further division. Elena tried to help him find clarity. Over cups of coffee and quiet conversations, she reminded him of the bigger picture. "This isn't just about you," she said gently. "It's about every person who has ever been treated this way. You have a platform now. Use it." Her words struck a chord. Marcus realized that while the incident had shaken him deeply, it also presented an opportunity. He could use his experience to shine a light on the broader issues plaguing law enforcement. He could amplify the voices of those who had long been ignored or silenced, and perhaps, in doing so, he could inspire meaningful change, even if it came at great personal cost. As the days passed, Marcus threw himself into work, channeling his frustration into action. He met with civil rights leaders, brainstorming ways to hold police departments accountable. He spoke at press conferences, sharing his story and urging Americans to confront the uncomfortable truths about race and power. He pushed for new policies, aimed at addressing implicit bias and improving community relations. Yet despite his efforts, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The incident had exposed cracks in the foundation of trust, not just between law enforcement and the communities they served, but within the FBI itself. Allies who had once stood firmly by his side now seemed hesitant, their support tinged with caution. Opponents seized on the controversy, using it to undermine his authority and question his fitness for leadership. One evening, as Marcus sat alone, in his office staring at a stack of briefing papers, he felt the weight of everything pressing down on him. For years, he had believed that his position gave him a certain level of protection, that his achievements and credentials shielded him from the harsh realities faced by others. But the traffic stop had shattered that illusion. It forced him to confront a painful truth. No matter how far he rose, he would always be seen through the lens of prejudice. And yet, amid the turmoil, Marcus found a glimmer of resolve. He thought about the young activists marching in the streets, the families seeking justice for loved ones lost to police violence, the countless individuals fighting for a better future. Their courage inspired him to keep going, to keep pushing forward, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As he turned off the lights and locked up his office, Marcus reminded himself of why he had chosen this path in the first place. Change wouldn't come overnight, and it certainly wouldn't come without sacrifice. But if his story could spark even a small measure of progress, then perhaps none of this would be in vain. The pressure on Marcus Hayes continued to mount as the days turned into weeks. The traffic stop incident had become a national talking point, dominating headlines and fueling debates about race, policing, and accountability. While many praised Marcus for his grace under fire, others used the controversy to question his leadership and suitability for the role of FBI director. Behind closed doors, influential figures within the government began to orchestrate a campaign that would ultimately test Marcus's resolve and force him to make one of the hardest decisions of his life. At first, the calls came subtly. A senior advisor in the White House reached out to express concern about the growing unrest surrounding Marcus's case. "It's creating division," the advisor said during a private phone call. People are starting to lose confidence, not just in law enforcement, but in the Bureau itself. The implication was clear. Marcus's presence at the helm of the FBI was becoming a liability. Other conversations followed, each more direct than the last. Members of Congress, both allies and opponents, held private meetings with Marcus to discuss the situation. Some urged him to take a step back temporarily, suggesting that a brief leave of absence might allow tensions to cool. Others went further, hinting that resigning altogether might be the best course of action for everyone involved. They framed it not as punishment, but as a strategic move, a way to preserve his legacy while giving the administration room to address the crisis without distraction. Even within the FBI, whispers of doubt began to surface. Anonymous memos circulated among senior staff, questioning whether Marcus could effectively lead an agency embroiled in such controversy. Former colleagues who had once admired him now expressed reservations about his ability to navigate the political minefield. One particularly damning memo suggested that Marcus's outspoken stance on reform had alienated key stakeholders, making it harder for the Bureau to function smoothly. For Marcus, these developments were deeply unsettling. He had always prided himself on being a uniter, someone who could bridge divides and bring people together. But now, he found himself at the center of a storm that seemed intent on tearing him apart. Every decision he made, every word he spoke, was scrutinized and dissected. Even actions unrelated to the traffic stop, routine policy announcements or operational updates, were viewed through the lens of the scandal. Compounding the external pressures was the toll it took on Marcus personally. He had always been a private man, preferring to keep his struggles behind closed doors. But the constant barrage of criticism weighed heavily on him. Nights became sleepless as he replayed conversations in his head, wondering if he should have said something differently or taken a firmer stand. Mornings brought fresh waves of anxiety as he prepared to face another day of relentless scrutiny. Elena noticed the change in him immediately. Gone was the confident, composed man she had married. In his place was someone burdened by doubt and exhaustion. She tried her best to support him, reminding him of all he had accomplished and encouraging him to stay true to his principles, but even she couldn't shield him from the reality of the situation. "This isn't fair," she told him one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "But sometimes doing the right thing means taking hits you don't deserve." Despite the mounting pressure, Marcus initially resisted the idea of stepping down. He believed that quitting would send the wrong message, that it would validate those who sought to silence him. "If I leave now," he confided in Elena, "they win. They get to say that this job is too big for someone like me, that I wasn't cut out for it because of who I am." But as the weeks dragged on, the arguments against staying grew louder and more persuasive. Public opinion polls showed declining approval ratings for the FBI, with critics blaming Marcus's leadership style for the drop. Anonymous leaks continued to paint him as divisive, accusing him of prioritizing social justice over national security. Even some of his closest allies began to waver, urging him to consider the greater good. One particularly difficult meeting came when Marcus sat down with the Attorney General. The two men had a long history of collaboration, and Marcus had always respected the Attorney General's judgment. But this time the conversation felt different. After exchanging pleasantries, the Attorney General got straight to the point. "Marcus," he said, leaning forward in his chair, "you've done incredible work for this country. No one can deny that. But we're at a crossroads here. The Bureau needs stability right now, and unfortunately your name has become synonymous with controversy. Staying on might only make things worse, for you, for the FBI, and for the reforms you've fought so hard to implement." Marcus listened silently, his jaw tightening slightly. He knew the Attorney General was speaking from a place of pragmatism rather than malice, but the words stung nonetheless. When the meeting ended, he walked out feeling hollow, as though a piece of him had been stripped away. That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he allowed himself to entertain the possibility of resignation. It wasn't surrender, it was strategy. By stepping aside, he could shift the focus back to the issues that mattered most: police accountability, systemic racism, and the need for meaningful reform. His departure might even galvanize supporters to push harder for change, using his story as a rallying cry. Still, the thought of leaving filled him with dread. The FBI had been his life's work, his mission. Walking away felt like admitting defeat, like letting the system win. Yet deep down, he knew that staying might come at too great a cost, not just to his mental health, but to the causes he cared about. The final straw came during a tense family dinner. Marcus's teenage son, Jordan, had always looked up to his father as a hero, but lately, Jordan had grown quiet, withdrawing into himself. That evening, as they sat around the table, Jordan finally broke his silence. "Dad," he said hesitantly, "do you ever think about what happens if you stay? Like, what it does to us? To Mom? To you?" Marcus froze, caught off guard by the question. He opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. Instead, he looked across the table at Elena, whose eyes glistened with unshed tears. In that moment, he realized how much the ordeal had affected not just him, but his entire family. They had endured insults, threats, and sleepless nights, all because of his refusal to back down. After dinner, Marcus retreated to his study, where he spent hours, pacing back and forth. He weighed the pros and cons, considering every angle. Finally, he reached a decision. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't what he wanted, but it was what he believed was necessary. The next morning, Marcus called a press conference. Reporters packed the room, their cameras flashing as he stepped up to the podium. His expression was calm, though his eyes betrayed the weight of his choice. Clearing his throat, he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "After much reflection, I have decided to step down as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." A hush fell over the crowd. Journalists exchanged stunned glances, unsure of how to react. Marcus paused, allowing the gravity of his announcement to sink in before continuing. "This decision was not made lightly. I took on this role with the belief that I could help steer the Bureau toward a brighter, more inclusive future. And while I am proud of the progress we've made, I recognize that my presence has become a source of division, one that threatens to overshadow the important work still ahead." His voice cracked slightly as he added, "I will always stand by my commitment to justice and equality. But I also understand that sometimes the greatest act of leadership is knowing when to step aside." As Marcus concluded his remarks, applause erupted from some corners of the room, though it was muted by the somber tone of the occasion. Outside, protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Director Hayes," and "We stand with you." Social media lit up with tributes as supporters hailed Marcus as a martyr for the cause of reform. Yet not everyone was pleased. Critics seized on his resignation as proof that he lacked the resilience required for such a demanding role. Anonymous sources within the FBI claimed that his departure marked the beginning of a new era, one free from the distractions of politics and ideology. For Marcus, the aftermath was bittersweet. On one hand, he felt a sense of relief, as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. On the other, he couldn't ignore the sting of failure, the knowledge that he had been forced out of a position he had worked so hard to achieve. In the weeks that followed, Marcus focused on healing not just himself but his family. He spent more time with Elena and Jordan, rediscovering the joys of simple moments together. He reconnected with old friends, many of whom reached out to offer their support. And slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his sense of purpose. Though he was no longer FBI director, Marcus refused to fade into obscurity. He threw himself into advocacy work, partnering with grassroots organizations to push for police reform. He gave speeches at universities, sharing his story and urging young people to fight for a better future. And he started writing a memoir detailing his journey titled Blind Justice, which would go on to become a bestseller. Through it all, Marcus held on to one truth. His worth was not defined by a title or a position. What mattered most was the impact he left behind, and the legacy H. The days following Marcus Hayes's resignation were a whirlwind of emotions. On one hand, he felt a strange sense of liberation, freedom from the relentless scrutiny and political maneuvering that had come with being the FBI director. On the other hand, there was an undeniable void, a lingering ache that reminded him of what he had lost. For years, his identity had been tied to his role as a leader in law enforcement. Now, stripped of that title, he had to redefine who he was and what he stood for. At first, Marcus struggled to adjust to his new reality. Gone were the early morning briefings, the late-night strategy sessions, and the constant buzz of activity that had defined his life for so long. In their place was silence, a quietness that felt both foreign and unsettling. He spent hours sitting in his study, staring out the window, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. The traffic stop, the public outcry, the political pressure. It all seemed like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite put together. Elena noticed the change in him immediately. While she was relieved that the chaos of his tenure as FBI director had ended, she worried about how deeply the experience had affected him. "You've carried so much on your shoulders," she told him one evening, as they sat together on the porch. "Maybe this is your chance to breathe, to figure out what you really want." Her words struck a chord. Marcus realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't bound by the expectations of others. He didn't have to navigate the delicate balance between policy and politics, or worry about pleasing powerful stakeholders. This was his opportunity to focus on the issues that truly mattered to him, and to do so on his own terms. Determined. To find purpose, Marcus began reaching out to old allies and mentors. He connected with civil rights activists, community leaders, and grassroots organizers who had spent decades fighting for justice. Their passion reignited something within him, a spark of determination that reminded him why he had entered law enforcement in the first place. Together, they brainstormed ways to push for meaningful reform, leveraging Marcus's platform to amplify voices that had long been ignored. One of his first major initiatives involved partnering with a coalition of advocacy groups to launch a nationwide campaign against racial profiling. Dubbed Justice Without Bias, the effort aimed to educate law enforcement agencies on implicit bias, promote transparency in police practices, and advocate for stricter accountability measures. Marcus traveled across the country speaking at town halls, schools, and community centers. His speeches were raw and heartfelt, drawing on his own experiences to highlight the urgent need for change. "I know what it feels like to be seen, not as a person, but as a stereotype," he told a packed auditorium in Chicago during one particularly moving event. "I've felt the weight of prejudice even when I thought I was immune to it. But let me tell you something. No one should have to endure that. Not me, not you, not anyone. It's time we demand better, for ourselves, for our children, and for future generations." His words resonated deeply with audiences, many of whom saw themselves in his story. Young activists approached him after events, thanking him for using his voice to shine a light on their struggles. Parents shared tearful accounts of loved ones lost to police violence, urging him to keep pushing for reform. Even former critics softened their stance, acknowledging the sincerity of his efforts. But despite the progress he made, Marcus couldn't escape the shadow of his resignation. Critics continued to question his decision, accusing him of abandoning ship when the going got tough. Anonymous op-eds appeared in major newspapers, dissecting his leadership style and speculating about whether he had simply cracked under pressure. Some even suggested that his advocacy work was nothing more than a PR stunt, an attempt to salvage his reputation. Marcus refused to engage with these attacks. Instead, he channeled his energy into action, focusing on tangible outcomes rather than empty rhetoric. He worked tirelessly behind the scenes, collaborating with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at increasing police accountability. He testified before Congress, urging legislators to prioritize reforms over partisan bickering, and he partnered with researchers to develop data-driven solutions that could address systemic issues within law enforcement. His efforts paid off. Within months, several states passed laws requiring mandatory body cameras for officers and establishing independent oversight boards to investigate misconduct. Federal funding was allocated to train police departments on de-escalation tactics and cultural sensitivity. While far from perfect, these measures represented significant steps forward, and Marcus took pride in knowing that his work had helped pave the way. Still, the journey wasn't without its challenges. There were moments of doubt, times when Marcus questioned whether any of this would truly make a difference. Late nights spent poring over reports and statistics left him exhausted, and the slow pace of change often felt frustratingly inadequate. Some days he wondered if he was fighting a losing battle, if the system was simply too entrenched to be reformed. It was during one of these low points that Marcus received an unexpected visit from his son, Jordan. Now a college freshman studying political science, Jordan had grown increasingly inspired by his father's resilience. He walked into Marcus's home office carrying a stack of papers and a determined look on his face. "Dad, I've been thinking," Jordan said, setting the papers down on the desk. "What if we started documenting everything? Like every case of police misconduct, every success story from reform efforts, we could create a database to track progress over time." Marcus stared at his son, momentarily speechless. The idea was simple yet brilliant, a way to hold institutions accountable while also highlighting the positive impact of reform. "That's actually a great idea," he said finally, a smile spreading across his face. "Let's do it." Together, father and son embarked on the project, pouring countless hours into building what would eventually become known as the National Justice Accountability Database. The platform allowed users to submit reports of police interactions, analyze trends, and access resources for advocating change. It quickly gained traction, earning praise from activists and scholars alike. As the database grew, so did Marcus's sense of fulfillment. For the first time since his resignation, he felt like he was making real progress. Not just ticking boxes or appeasing critics, but creating tools that empowered others to take action. The work gave him hope, reminding him that even small victories could add up to something meaningful. Yet amid the triumphs, there were still reminders of the road ahead. One evening, as Marcus scrolled through social media, he came across a video of another black man being pulled over by police. The scene was eerily familiar. The flashing lights, the drawn guns, the palpable tension. Watching it brought back memories of his own ordeal, leaving him shaken and angry. He called Elena into the room, showing her the footage. "How many more times does this have to happen?" he asked, his voice trembling with frustration. "How many lives have to be ruined or lost before people wake up?" Elena hugged him tightly, offering what comfort she could. "Change takes time," she said softly. "But every step matters. Every voice matters. You're doing your part, Marcus. Don't forget that." Her words stayed with him long after the conversation ended. They reminded him that while the fight for justice was far from over, he wasn't alone. Millions of people around the world were standing alongside him, refusing to give up despite the odds. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be difficult, Marcus knew he had the strength to keep going, as long as he kept remembering why he started in the first place. By the end of the year, Marcus had transformed himself from a disgraced former official into a symbol of perseverance and hope. His memoir, Blind Justice, became a national bestseller, sparking renewed conversations about race, policing, and accountability. Readers praised his honesty and vulnerability, saying the book had opened their eyes to the realities faced by marginalized communities. Schools added it to their curricula, ensuring that future generations would learn from his experiences. Through it all, Marcus remained grounded, focusing not on accolades, but on impact. He understood that true change wouldn't come from grand gestures or fleeting moments of fame, but from consistent, dedicated effort. And while he couldn't undo the injustices of the past, he could help shape a better future, one step at a time. As he stood on stage at a rally in Washington, D.C., Addressing thousands of supporters who had gathered to celebrate progress and demand further reforms, Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. Looking out at the sea of faces, he saw determination, resilience, and hope. These were the people who inspired him to keep fighting, the reason he got up every morning ready to tackle whatever challenges lay ahead. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady and strong. "It's about all of us. Together we can build a world where no one has to fear the very systems meant to protect them. A world where justice is blind, but fair." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. For Marcus Hayes, it was a moment of validation. Not because he had proven his critics wrong, but because he had stayed true to himself and his mission. And in that moment, he knew he had found his purpose once again. Months turned into years, and Marcus Hayes settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and new. His resignation as FBI director had been a seismic event in his life, but it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something different, something deeper. Over time, he came to see that losing his job hadn't diminished him. Instead, it had given him clarity. For the first time in decades, he could focus on what truly mattered, building a legacy that would outlast any title or position. Marcus spent his days traveling across the country, meeting with activists, educators, and community leaders. He spoke at universities, addressing students who were eager to learn from his experiences and inspired by his resilience. His speeches weren't just about policy reform. They were personal stories of struggle, perseverance, and hope. He shared how the traffic stop had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he had once served. But he also talked about the lessons he had learned, that change doesn't happen overnight, and that progress often comes through pain. One of his favorite stops was a small college in Alabama, where he addressed a packed auditorium of young, Black students. As he stood on stage, looking out at their faces filled with curiosity and determination, he felt a lump rise in his throat. "When I was your age," he began, "I never imagined I'd be standing here today. I dreamed big, sure, but I also faced obstacles that made me question whether those dreams were worth chasing. What kept me going was the belief that my voice mattered, that even if I couldn't fix everything, I could still make a difference." Afterward, dozens of students lined up to speak with him, sharing their own aspirations and fears. Some wanted advice on navigating careers in law enforcement. Others sought guidance on how to stay hopeful in the face of adversity. Marcus listened intently, offering words of encouragement and wisdom. It reminded him of why he had chosen this path, to inspire the next generation to keep fighting for justice, no matter how hard the road might seem. Back home, Marcus continued, working on the National Justice Accountability Database, which had become a cornerstone of his advocacy efforts. The platform had grown exponentially, collecting thousands of reports from individuals detailing their interactions with law enforcement. Researchers used the data to identify patterns of misconduct, while journalists relied on it to uncover systemic issues within police departments. Most importantly, it gave ordinary citizens a tool to hold institutions accountable, a way to ensure that no case of abuse went unnoticed. Jordan, now a senior in college, played a key role in expanding the database's reach. Together, father and son developed partnerships with tech companies to enhance its functionality, adding features like real-time reporting and anonymous submissions. They also launched an educational initiative aimed at teaching high school students about civic engagement and accountability. Seeing Jordan so passionate about the work filled Marcus with pride. It reassured him that the fight for justice would continue long after he was gone. But not everything was smooth sailing. Critics still lingered, determined to undermine Marcus's efforts. Conservative media outlets accused him of fueling anti-police sentiment, while some law enforcement unions dismissed the database as biased and unreliable. Anonymous trolls harassed him online, posting hateful comments and threatening messages. At times, the negativity wore on him, making him question whether all his hard work was worth it. Elena noticed when the stress became too much. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of reading vitriolic emails, Marcus sat slumped on the couch, staring blankly at the wall. Elena placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You're doing good work," she said firmly. "Don't let them steal your joy." Her words stuck with him. Marcus realized that focusing on the critics only gave them power. Instead, he chose to channel his energy into celebrating victories, no matter how small. When a local police department implemented reforms based on recommendations from the database, he marked the occasion with a quiet toast at dinner. When a young activist credited one of his speeches with inspiring her to pursue a career in public service, he wrote her a heartfelt note of encouragement. These moments reminded him that change was possible, and that he was part of something bigger than himself. Over time, Marcus's influence extended beyond activism. His memoir, Blind Justice, sparked widespread discussions about race and policing, becoming required reading in classrooms and book clubs alike. Readers praised its honesty and vulnerability, saying it helped them understand the complexities of systemic racism in ways they never had before. Marcus received letters from people around the world, thanking him for sharing his story and urging him to keep pushing for reform. The memoir also opened doors to new opportunities. Marcus was invited to join advisory boards for organizations focused on criminal justice reform, lending his expertise to shape policies at the national level. He collaborated with filmmakers to produce a documentary series exploring the roots of racial profiling and its impact on communities of color. Each project brought fresh challenges, but they also reinforced his belief in the power of storytelling to drive change. As the years passed, Marcus found peace in knowing that his legacy wasn't defined by a single moment, whether it was his appointment as FBI director or his controversial resignation, but by the cumulative impact of his actions. He thought often about the traffic stop that had changed everything. While it had been humiliating and painful, it had also been transformative. It forced him to confront the realities of systemic racism and to use his platform to amplify voices that had long been silenced. In interviews, Marcus was candid about the emotional toll the incident had taken. "There are nights when I still think about it," he admitted during a television appearance, about how it felt to have guns pointed at me, to be treated like a suspect simply because of the color of my skin. "But I also think about what I've learned since then about the importance of speaking truth to power, even when it's uncomfortable. If sharing my story can help someone else feel less alone, then maybe it was worth it." By the time he reached his late 50s, Marcus had earned a reputation as a steadfast advocate for justice. Young activists hailed him as a hero, crediting him with galvanizing a new generation of leaders. Even some former detractors softened their stance, acknowledging the sincerity of his efforts and the positive changes he had helped bring about. While not everyone agreed with his methods, few could deny the depth of his commitment. One of the most poignant moments came during a ceremony honoring civil rights pioneers. Marcus was awarded a Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to the movement. As he accepted the accolade, he took a moment to reflect on the journey that had led him there. "I didn't set out to be a symbol," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I just wanted to do my part to leave the world a little better than I found it. If anything I've done has inspired others to keep fighting, then I consider that a victory." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. For Marcus, it was a moment of validation, not because he had proven his critics wrong, but because he had stayed true to himself and his mission, and in that moment, he knew he had found his purpose once again. Years later, as Marcus sat on the porch of his home, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he allowed himself to reflect on everything he had accomplished. The road had been long and difficult, marked by setbacks and sacrifices, but it had also been rewarding in ways he never could have anticipated. He had built bridges between communities, inspired countless individuals to take action, and created tools that would continue driving change long after he was gone. Elena joined him on the porch, handing him a cup of tea. "You've done good, Marcus," she said with a smile. "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." He nodded, gazing out at the fading light. "It's funny," he mused. I spent so much of my life chasing titles and achievements thinking they would define me. But now I realize that none of that matters. What matters is the impact you leave behind, the lives you touch, the doors you open, the hope you give to others. As darkness fell, Marcus felt a profound sense of gratitude for the challenges that had shaped him, for the loved ones who had stood by him, and for the opportunity to make a difference. He knew the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew he had played his part, and sometimes that was enough.